Hey everyone, welcome back to Untangled Vines, Redefining the Rules of Work. Today we have a special guest, Alex Couture. He's actually Grapevine's founding advisor as well. So I'm excited to have him on the podcast. We've been talking about this for a little while. Alex, thanks for being a part of the Untangled Vines community, and thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, buddy. I'm super pumped. I woke up this morning, got off the treadmill, my exercise, and I was like, let's go. We got Zach this morning. So I'm really
That's
pumped, buddy.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. We might sidetrack just for anybody listening. We have a couple of things that we're going to talk about, but that's your warning. So, Alex, I want to go ahead and start with your journey. I gave a little bit of an introduction at the beginning of this, but I know when you were at CDW and then eventually building your own company, SceneDoc, I'm assuming that you were in the office the majority of the time. And obviously, Grapevine is a virtual office for the remote and hybrid workforce. So, looking back, can you tell us how you started your career and how has the shift into the future of work changed your approach to work?
Yeah, that's a great question, Zach. So yeah, 21 or so years ago, started my career as an inside sales guy at CDW. It was really my first step into professional sales arena. And yeah, 21 years ago, we were all in an office. And I would say, for where I was in my career at that time, and then, you take into the context that the technology that we have today and the technology, that things that you're brewing up at Grapevine weren't available to us 21 years ago. So, being in the office around people was actually a really important part, I think, of my success and my learning 21 some odd years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I know that there's been articles out there, like, and I always pick on Jamie Dimon. Obviously, he probably hasn't heard it, but I pick on him because he'll talk about how you can't train people or you can't get the same type of experience from your employees if they're not in the office. So can you speak to that? Because I know, like you said, you were in the office, that's where you started, but now you're mainly doing remote work in a sense, but then you also like travel or meet up with some of the clients that you're working with. So do you believe that? Do you think it's a fact or a myth that uh, you have to be in the office to get that appropriate training, to build a culture and everything that people say is about like productivity in office versus remote?
Yeah. Listen, I think that, so for the last 5 years, I've been 100% remote. And I would say that I think it's a complete fallacy that we cannot enable and train effectively remotely, like full stop. So I think that is a misnomer. It's complete BS. So I think that there's a couple things that contribute that. Like, one is like the tech stack has gotten better, right? Again, 21 years ago, we didn't have a lot of the tools that we have today, right? So when we think about Zoom and Teams and, all the front end webcasters, that gives us a great ability to collaborate, to engage. Think about you and I, where we first met at Kumu. We're an enterprise video SaaS provider, helping with synchronous and asynchronous video technology. Like, those tools help. It helps us get to, enabling teams remotely. So I think it can absolutely be done today. Like, listen, the facts are there's going to be certain roles, perhaps outside of knowledge working tech, that like you still need to be in the office, right? Like, your wife works in a hospital. My mother was raised in a hospital professionally, right? Like, that's where she worked. Like, there's going to be some roles that, like, you can't take remote. But the notion of learning, I think, can be done anywhere, facilitated with the right tech.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm biased. I'm building a whole product around it, but I 100% agree. I was gonna say one of the reasons that I believe in this is what you mentioned there is we actually met through Zoom. Well, first of all, let's back it up. Like, we met, I applied to a position via LinkedIn, and then I was lucky enough to get pulled into an interview, and then I met you. I met all of our other colleagues. For the longest time, we didn't meet in person, and I mean, I am a go-getter type A personality, so maybe I do things a little bit differently than another type of employee where they maybe need a little bit more handholding. But I still feel like we were able to build culture. You and I were able to build a professional relationship that um, wasn't face to face. And so like whenever people like Simon Sinek, I'm throwing a lot of people under the bus. I love Simon Sinek. I got some books back here, but whenever he says like nothing can replace face to face interaction, I disagree with that wholeheartedly, because it's not the face-to-face interaction that matters. It's the context of the conversations and what you're trying to do. And we always talk about intentionality on this podcast. So I think what you mentioned is like the mixture of the tools, and then what I'm bringing to the table too, not from Grapevine, but just you, a software is only going to do so much. So you also have to have your foundation for your company. And that kind of segues into the next question, because I know that you've worked with several startups and companies that are remote and hybrid. We've talked about this a little bit, but can you share your insights into some of the biggest challenges you see when working with these companies as it relates specifically to remote or hybrid, um, compared to in office?
Well, the biggest thing is the culture building, right? Like, right,
Mm-hmm.
that's our one of our primary roles as founders, in startups and companies as leaders, is to build a strong foundation of culture. You know, you and I have joked around over these past few months as like, you know, in this hybrid and remote first world, like, you know, what replaces the ping pong table, right? Like,
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
like that it's humorous, but it's also real, right? Is like, what are we going to do in place of those things? So there's a couple
Mm-hmm.
things that come to my mind. Like, one is you talk about intentionality. Like, I might say we have to be deliberate. Like, this is a
Yeah,
time in leadership that you have to be really deliberate about the quality of leadership, how you're engaging with people, when you're engaging people, what you're speaking about, right? Like, it's
yeah,
one thing to have one-on-ones, for example, remotely, but are those one-on-ones just about business, or are they really taking a people first approach? Like, are we spending the first half of that call, or if not, maybe the entire one-on-one, getting to know each other, speaking about
yeah.
things that are personal, right? And so, like, that to me is like the intentionality I think that you described. Like, how are we being deliberate the time and in the time we're engaging with our teams remotely? Like, that I think is a big piece.
Yeah, yeah, and I talk about that a lot because I think that we might even be asking the wrong question. Is in office the right way? Is remote the right way? Is hybrid? I think the question really is, are we running our companies intentionally or deliberately?
Agreed.
And if you're
Yeah.
not, then that is the issue.
Right.
It's not that like remote work is the issue, because we've seen it happen. Like you look at companies like Yelp, you look at companies like Atlassian. There's tons of them out there that operate 100% remote. And so you're telling me that you can't do that because of an excuse that you're making because you don't want to take the time to have that intentionality, to have that structure, to be deliberate. And that does include getting to know your employees, not just
Right.
from
Right.
a business perspective, but a personal perspective. And you do that really well. So like, and you kind of mentioned some of the frameworks that we leverage, or we're trying to build into Grapevine's product, which is like that constant one-on-one connection, the feedback to be able to build that culture, the community where you can see people personally and professionally. Um, what type of tips do you have for? I mean, this could be for any leader, in office, remote, whatever. What type of tips do you have for building that relationship that goes beyond just professional? Because you do a really good job at this. I've witnessed it firsthand.
Well, I appreciate that, man. Listen, it comes back to maybe a leadership principle I was taught decades ago, which is like actually give a shit, right? Like actually care, right? Sometimes it's like
Yeah.
this basic thing that we overlook, right? Is like we just, again,
Hmm.
this is why I think that's why I think a high percentage of leaders are, you know, failing, is because they don't take the time to actually care, like come from a place of
Yeah.
authenticity, of being empathetic, being kind, trying to understand what that person's going through the lens of these Zoom frames that we're all sitting in front of most of our days, right? Like
Yeah.
that's what it takes, right? Like one of the things you mentioned earlier, and you know, being a student of the game of sales, I'd say this, and you've seen this as my right hand guy, Zach, is that like most companies suck at enablement. Most. they
Yeah.
suck at training new staff, right? We just expect that, like, they come
Hmm.
on, and because they're skilled, like, we can just throw them into the deep end and they're going to be successful. And then, a year
Yeah.
later, we're all looking at each other like, hey, how come they're not performing? We got to fire them. That's when the rifts start coming in, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's just a
Oh,
terrible cycle, right? And one of the things that I was thinking about as you were speaking last is that teams were horrible at enabling and onboarding new people far before we went remote and hybrid, right? Like
exactly.
that was happening for eons. And so I think it's
Yeah.
just been exasperated. Like it's been now, like there's a big light that shines on it because we're hybrid and remote. And I think those poor leaders now, their takeaway is that hybrid and remote's not working, when in fact they just didn't have frameworks and processes and the right people in place to actually care to make
Yeah.
training and onboarding and engagement an effective process. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it makes 100% sense. And there's so much to take away that I'll probably forget and I'll have to re-listen to it. But yeah, there's a combination of certain things on Friday. Like, I do Startup Founder Fridays on LinkedIn. And one of the things I said was like the biggest problem with work isn't return to office, isn't remote, isn't flexibility, it's leadership.
Right.
And so
The
like
lack
you can
thereof.
you can tie.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's what I think remote work calls out. It remote work doesn't allow ugly to stay hidden,
I think well
you
said.
know?
Totally agree. Totally agree.
And like if we think about, like you were saying, when in the typical, like let's take CDW. I'm going to take some assumptions and then you correct me. But like whenever you were onboarding to CDW, and I know that you love CDW, you rep them, and that's like where you got your start. But I can imagine that you might have had like at the best like a full on month training, learning, and development program that they took you through. And then it was kind of like out to the trenches, and then you had to learn as you go. I don't know if CDW is like that, but that's what I've experienced in a lot of companies where they'll get you set up, onboarded as far as HR, as far as getting access to the tools, as far as maybe getting a couple of materials, but then they don't take it a step further and go all in on a department specific training.
Yeah.
Like if you're coming in for sales, now you need to know these Salesforce stages, these HubSpot stages. How does this interact with all that? How do you do that? All that kind of stuff. Is that your experience? Maybe not at CDW, but in previous
Yeah.
roles, and
Yeah.
even as a CEO of SceneDoc.
So listen, I think that I was super blessed to have come through CDW because actually they had a world-class enablement
Oh, nice.
process. And honestly, it's
Good.
transformed my view of like what good looks like, right? So like I think that's the
Mm,
benefit I've had, Zach. Like when you and I were building our sales operation at Kumu, like I think it turned out to be pretty darn world class. We were a flat
yeah.
organization, we were global, we had people everywhere around the world, and yet we were able to do a lot of things remote first, using tech, having good process in place, having people that give a shit, right? And
Hmm.
all of that is the recipe for strong enablement. Now, fast forward 21 years ago at CDW, they had this thing called like CDW University, I believe is what it was called. And it was an
Hmm.
ongoing curriculum. And so I would
Yes.
say the difference at CDW than it is in 99.9999% of companies is that they were very deliberate on giving every one of their reps, every staff member, quite frankly, every coworker,
Hmm.
a path to success. And they knew that wasn't a
Yes.
30-day sprint, a 60-day sprint, a 90-day sprint. That was a continuous sprint, right? And
Hmm.
so I was really fortunate to see an amazing example really early in my career, my first gig.
Hmm.
And so actually everything thereafter, I was benchmarking against that. And if it didn't look
Hmm.
like that, I thought it sucked. And the facts are most
Yeah.
of them suck, right? And
Yeah.
so that was a transformative period for me, actually seeing how they did it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, whenever you were at CDW compared to when you were running your own company, how did you implement that as what you saw there and making yours world class? Or because a lot of times
Yeah.
what happens as leaders is we know what's great, but then we have all these other things that we got to do, and then sometimes things fall to the wayside. Were you
Yeah.
able to translate that into SceneDoc as
So
well?
you know all those books of mistakes that I could write? This is one of those mistakes. I think this is one of those mistakes that as a first-time CEO and a first-time founder, I failed at. I wasn't good at
Mm,
like taking the things I learned and building them into SceneDoc as early as I should have. Now we got there
mm,
eventually, and I think it came down to like people, process, and tech. We had like
mm-hmm,
the right foundation to onboard people successfully. And keep in mind, when we started SceneDoc, this was 2010, 2011. Actually, before there was hybrid and remote, we were hybrid because there was some of our staff that were here in Toronto, and then there was many of our sales folks and sales engineers that were spread across the US. And they were quota
nice.
carrying sales guys and gals that were embedded in geography. So we were
Mm-hmm.
hybrid then. We didn't actually know it, but when I look back, like the first couple of years, we were hiring people, throwing them into the deep end. We were hiring them with
Mm,
domain expertise. Again, they understood our customer set, they understood our ideal customer profile, they understood the market we served. And so that
mm-hmm.
was my mistake. I took that as, hey, I don't need to spend as much time as I need to successfully
Yeah.
onboarding these people. And so that resulted in failure in the short term.
Mm.
Again, we got our acts
That's
together eventually. I tip my hat actually largely to my
yeah.
business partner, Adrian, because he was very much a process junkie. And so he was like,
Yeah.
hey, Alex, you're effing up at this, and we need to get better at this if we're going to, hire people and have, a sustainability, right? Because the reality is great employees are not going to stay at a company where they're not growing. I don't believe that. And I think that's
Yeah.
even more true in 2023 as we go into 2024. If you don't have good onboarding plans, if you don't have continuous learning opportunities, if you don't have good tech that drives
Mm-hmm.
engagement, you are going to fail. And so
Yeah.
now over the last 2.5 years, I've now have a few dozen startup CEOs that I've mentored and coached. Like that's what I spend time talking about. Is like you need to put the right foundation and surround your employee and your team with all the things they need to succeed.
Yeah, and one of the call outs there I think is extremely important is even though you hire smart people and they might have domain experience or they might just be very bright, intelligent, and they know how to get things done, you can't assume that they don't need training or that they don't want training. Because I think, yeah, I mean, I've seen this, I've made this mistake in other companies that I worked in where this person might be coming from a competitor. And so now you're like, oh, well, they know what they're talking about. Let's learn from them and kind of forget about getting them acclimated to what we do. So that's a very important thing, and I've experienced that from the employee side as well as the employer side. And so like I always talk about job characteristics model is by Jack or Hackman and Oldham, and one of the things that they talk about as a moderating factor for growth or for motivation, satisfaction, and engagement of an employee is growth need strength. And what that means is you have to match the employee's growth, uh, their their level of what they want to grow into or how they want to grow, and then have that or have those resources or those trainings or whatever it is to match those on the same level. And obviously every employee is different, so like I might want to, I mean, now I'm founder of Grapevine, but I want to turn into a real CEO, and so I need to have, with your help and the network around us, to I need to be able to have that type of resource where it meets my growth needs strength, where somebody else, like we know a guy that was a sales engineer at Kumu. He didn't want to be a manager, but he was really, really great at what he did. And so now we had to meet his level of growth need, which wasn't management or leadership. It was becoming a better sales engineer.
Right.
It was becoming, how can we streamline certain things out of his brain into the greater good to raise the average of everyone. And so, yeah, that's what really stood out to me in that call out. I don't know if you have anything to add there
No, I think you wrapped it
from
well.
your end.
Yep.
Nice. Okay. So now I'm going to go to the next question. I told you we were going to get off some tangents, but I think they're all valuable and still connected to the topics. So this one is on navigating cultural transformation. So I know that you've led a lot of teams through cultural transformations, and I know the last company that we worked at, we worked in on doing that as well. So I was going to ask, can you walk us through one, how you help companies navigate through change in general, and then, and I can ask this again, but and then how do you think navigating change in a remote or hybrid environment is different than maybe in office?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I'm going to exactly answer that. I'm going to start actually in the second. Is that the navigating the change for me? And I actually learned this through Rose Bentley, who was our CEO at Kumu. She was really good at this. Is that you need to
Yeah.
over communicate, right? You got to
Oh
spend
yeah.
ample time speaking to the team, right? Like last week, I
Mm-hmm.
was speaking about vision, and I'm a big fan of like this concept of a vivid vision, and taking it from like a 2 to 3 line statement to like a 2 to 3 page manifesto that like you can
Yeah.
get your entire team rallied around. But like to me, that's like an example of over communicating, right? Like oftentimes we
Mm-hmm.
leave vision to be a statement that we have on our website. But I actually
Yep.
think that, and this is one of the things Rose did really well, is like, how do you take that and start to embed that into everything that we do? The way we talk
Mm-hmm.
to new employees during interviewing processes, the way we talk to our board of directors at our companies when we're CEOs, the way we talk
Mm-hmm.
about this at all hands meetings, and we start with our why and our purpose, our mission, like our vision for what the next 5 years is going to look like. Like, I think that the way you navigate that change or transformation, as you're calling it, is to
Mm-hmm.
making sure that, again, you're deliberate and intentional about the way and the cadence to which you're communicating with your team, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
that does make sense. And just to call out Grapevine here, because obviously that's what we're doing. But because what I really liked, speaking of Rose, is she made sure that not only the vision, well, one, whenever we came into Kumu, no offense to Kumu, but like I didn't know what our vision
Well, there
was.
wasn't
I didn't know
really
what our
one.
mission
There
was.
wasn't really
Exactly,
one, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And what we see is a lot of people focus whenever it comes to like employee engagement, a lot of people focus on monetary value, which is very important. You have to give your employees enough where money doesn't become the focusing factor. And then once you get past that, now you have to have a purpose. Why do these people wake up every single day and work at your company? What are they trying to accomplish? And that's where vision and mission comes into play. So, you know me, I'm a big believer in that. We actually have an About Us page in Grapevine where companies can add their purpose of their company, the vision, the mission, and their core values, which is the next part that I want to talk about, which is what Rose did a lot was she led by example, and she would tie feedback to the core values. And Mercy Noah did this as well, our head of HR. And so like we thought about certain things as we're building Grapevine, and we can add those core values to any feedback that is presented out there to whoever receives it. And that's how you build culture remotely, is lead by example, recognize people whenever they do something great, and then tie it to what you're trying to build at your company through your core values and your vision and your mission. So I'll stop there because I'll keep going for an hour.
Honestly, that was my first experience seeing that, right? Like, again, having be deliberate in providing feedback out loud to the team broadly, and then tying it back to one or two of the core values. And there's a couple things that
Yeah.
happen there, right? One is you continue to reinforce the value set, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
is, I think, so critical, and it's like so often not done, right? Like,
Yeah.
again, it's like vision. Some people, like most companies, they have their 7, 8, 10 values that they slap under their website, and that's the extent of
Yeah.
communicating on core values. I'm of the
Yep.
complete other mindset that
Mhm.
like we communicate on vision, we should be like repeating and over communicating and regurgitating our core values as a company, because quite frankly, like
Mhm.
as a startup guy, Zach, like startups freaking
Mhm.
hard. it's plagued with really, really difficult days. And I'm a big
Yeah.
believer that the way you keep a startup team together and rowing in the same direction and reducing conflict is by having a shared value set, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I speak about this at nauseum. Like the way we hire, we should have alignment on values. The way you might
Hmm.
select a co-founder for your tech startup, you should align on values. Because when shit hits the fan, I've seen this now firsthand, and I've seen this with many of the companies that I've helped who both don't do it well and do it well. Is that you have to
Hmm.
get that part right. If you are in alignment on values, you have a moral compass that's shared, and so when things get difficult, you revert back to those shared values. And so it's no
Yeah.
different, like in the context that we're talking now. Like if I get to give you a kudos or a praise on something that you've done really well for the company, like tie that back to why that was important and why that
Yeah.
behavior was something we're calling out and why we're sending praise and why we're congratulating it.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to be specific in feedback too, because a generic feedback like "Great job today, Alex," that doesn't tell
Right.
you
It's meaningless in a
specifically
way.
what it is.
Yeah.
Y-
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it really is, right? Because like now that person is going to walk away. Maybe it was a presentation. Now they're going to walk away like wondering, like, was it the whole thing or was there like a specific thing? Whenever you're narrowing it down, and it all goes back to intentionality, deliberateness, like
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a word, but we'll pretend today. But it all goes back to that because, like, if you want to improve somebody, you have to be specific with them, right? And like whenever we're working together, because at Kumu you were the manager, I was the direct employee, and sometimes you would come to me and you would say something, and I'd be like, "Can you give me more detail?" And
Right.
so like that actually calls out a good point too, and maybe we can tie it into a question here, but like I think that the employee needs to be comfortable. You talk about psychological safety a lot. And so, like, the employee has to be, because we're talking about this from a top down approach right now, but the employee needs to be able to be comfortable enough to interact with their manager in a way that doesn't not call them out in a bad way, but calls them out where the employee gets what they need. You know, for that example, it was like, you might come to me and say, "Hey, can we do this?" And then I'll be like, yes, maybe. Can you give me more details? But if an employee feels like they're being micromanaged and they don't want to speak up because that manager might yell at them or belittle them, that doesn't create a good culture. And over time, that employee probably sooner rather than later is going to leave.
Yeah.
And now you have higher turnover, which costs a lot of money. So to tie this into a question for you, is how do you build that psychological safety? And it kind of goes to building that culture, but how do you build that psychological safety when working with employees, or either, because I know you work a lot with peers, so it's like it's not necessarily like they're reporting to you, but you're working alongside of them with a lot of C-level people. How do you kind of navigate that
Yeah.
in your experience?
So the thing that first comes to my mind is like an approach of being vulnerable, right? Being
Hmm.
transparent, being unafraid to like tell your peers or your team that you don't know something, or
Mm.
unafraid to tell them that you failed at something, you made a big mistake as the leader.
Yeah.
I think like that gives the ability for a team to feel safe, not just psychologically,
Hmm.
but like, making a mistake, knowing that like, in some ways that failure, if it's calculated and done right, like should be praised in a lot of ways. Like kudos for taking the risk and like breaking something. And then like, yeah, it failed,
Hmm.
but like, let's reflect on it adequately and then move forward. Right. Like
Yeah.
that to me is what creates safety. And I tell you, that's what another thing I learned at CDW. And I think like a lot of the kudos I've gotten from guys like you, that where I do this is because of a great leader I had 21 years ago, JD Hupp, who's still a
Yeah.
good friend. I've talked about JD at length
Mhm.
about to you, is that he used to always tell me this, dude, there's nothing you can break that we won't be able to fix together. So go out and break it.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah.
Dude, it was super powerful for me because I was just learning about the professional sport and arena of sales, I
Hmm.
was dealing with huge clients that were spending lots of money. I didn't want to screw things up. Heaven forbid, I didn't want to lose a customer. Right? I always had that
Yeah.
mentality. And so if you are not given a safe place to operate from, like that can be a detrimental, like that's not fun. It's not fun
Yeah.
to work in that type of an environment. But the environment
Yeah.
he created for me was go and do the best thing you can for that customer, right? Always come
Yeah.
from a good place of like service and wanting to help. And the environment he created for me was one that I didn't care to fail. I was okay with failing at something so long as I tried. And
Yeah.
that was game changing, psychological mechanism of management that I learned through JD. That I'm very again intentional about how I do that with people
Yeah.
today. Like our startup was like that. I could do startup again. Is it's littered with bad days of like you picking some feature to develop and it fails 19 times before you get it right, identifying your
Hmm.
repeatable sale to your ICP, like that takes a lot of falling down before you actually figure it out. And so
Yeah.
I think I've always been, and I hope people who've ever worked with me would say this, is that I think Alex has brought that forward into my management style, is like just like being uber transparent, wearing your heart on your sleeve, being completely comfortable with admitting when you failed or F something up, and then, reflecting
Yeah.
on it and moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's like two things that I wanted to call out on that is because what you're basically saying that JD did for you was give you permission to make a mistake,
Right.
where a lot of companies, a lot of leaders don't allow that to happen. And I think it's like this is in the same post that I was talking about for Startup Founder Fridays. I was talking about like whether they're a great leader or they're a decent leader or they're a new leader, you still need to implement leadership development programs. And because there's, I mean, you don't know what you don't know. And if you're not continuously learning, then you might be stuck in the past. And so what he was doing there was giving you permission, whether or not it sounded like CDW probably had a leadership development program. So whether he was born like that or they coached him or it was a mixture of both, maybe both, he allowed you to have that permission, which is the whole key of leading by example, setting a psychologically safe environment, and feeling like you have your manager or your manager's attention and you have your manager's support. Those are two key factors of engagement whenever it comes to employee engagement and productivity. The other part that I wanted to call out that you didn't necessarily mention, but I wanted to ask, because it's one thing is permission, but then the second thing is follow through. So a leader can say, hey, you can make a mistake, that's okay. But then sometimes I've experienced this where somebody will say that and then I'll do it and then I'll get reprimanded, or like there'll be a consequence. And that consequence, depending on what it is, sometimes it's justified, but in most cases it's not, because we don't work in the industry of life and death, right? So whenever we actually make a mistake, it's harmful to the company, but we didn't hurt anyone necessarily. And so like, how do you see the follow through, or how do you make sure that you give that permission through vulnerability, admitting your own mistakes, and then whenever it happens, following through, where now it doesn't just become words, it becomes a behavior that they can adopt?
I think this is where the tying back to values is an important thing, right? So like
Mm,
just take the praise concept, right? And I know it's one of the
mm-hmm.
capabilities, one of the many capabilities we're going to be able to do through Grapevine. But
Yes.
being able to not just tell somebody that they did a good job and tying it back to a value, I actually think it's amazing to see when I see managers shout out something that didn't work and tying it
Mm,
back to the value, right?
yeah.
Because I don't know, like bias
Yeah.
for action is, I know one that you and I both share, and it was something we both got at Kumu as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but bias for action could be the value to something that didn't work out. right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that
Yep.
it's equally important to recognize, because especially in tech, like you could have teams that are working on something important for months and months and months, and it might not work out. Like,
Yeah.
is that
Yep.
utter failure? No, like that's progress to me, right? So, like,
Yeah.
are we shouting that out? Hey, we want to shout out John and his whole team for working the last 8 months on this thing. And yes, it didn't work, but like kudos for them for taking action. Align it to the bias for action value set that's important to all of us. And
Yeah.
demonstrate to the whole team like that is something that we want to see here. Not everything's going to
Mm-hmm.
work, right? I mean, it's just like you and I, we joke all the time about on LinkedIn, like all you hear are the success stories, right? This is how you get rich
Yeah.
quick, and this is how you build your
Oh.
startup and exit at $100 million. No, like that's why I think I've been taking a really deliberate approach of like, doing like my Friday F ups, right? Like, how do
Mm-hmm.
we take lessons learned and surface that stuff? Because that to
Mm-hmm.
me is just like what we're talking about. Like, it's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay to have failed.
Yeah.
Like, again, there's going to be, you're building right now, dude. Like, don't you feel that most days? Like, most days, there's like
Yeah.
I'm sure parts of your day where you're like, damn, like, I just wasted a bunch of time on X, or this thing didn't work the way I thought it was going to work. But if you tie
Yeah.
that
No.
back to
100%.
your values, Zach, that's what's
Mm-hmm.
going to be, like, that's what's going to allow you to keep going.
Yeah, yeah, and one of the core values that we have at Grapevine is pioneer
Mm,
innovation. And I don't think that like you can pioneer innovation and be perfect, right?
right.
So we have to find a way to allow innovation to foster, to be curated through employees, and we have to be willing to accept failure on certain things. And I remember, I don't know if you remember this, but whenever we were interviewing, or whenever I was interviewing for Kumu, you asked me a question is like, it's something about failure, like what is like a big failure? And like I know this is like maybe like a gimmicky answer for interviews, but it was actually the truth, because I was trying to think of a failure, but it was difficult because I don't look at failure as failure. I look at it as a lesson learned. And the only way that failure can be a lesson learned is if you reflect on it and improve from it for the next time. And so that's what, like, if you're talking about innovation, just using our core value, we're going to have to be able to fail and learn to continue to have progress, right? We just, for example, like we might have a feature that we think is going to be great, but then we put it out there, nobody uses it,
Mm.
right? That's a failure, but now we know, and the lesson learned from that could be, okay, well, we're not going to take development hours and time and money to do that. We're going to put it away until maybe it gets brought up again, you know? So that was just kind of like a off the top example.
But in
Um,
product development, that
but
happens all the time, right? There are things that like
oh yeah.
startups build that like, in that moment of time are like product failures. And then,
Yeah.
3 years later, that chunk of code becomes the linchpin, or the catalyst, I should say, to some game
Yeah.
changing piece of the product and application down the road, right? So like what
Hmm.
might be a failure, or a challenge to us now, sometimes down the road becomes the thing that propels some of the coolest things in a company.
Yeah. And there's like tons of companies. I can't think of them off my head. But I know that I was reading a book one time, and there was a book that started off as a gaming uh, software. And then over time, it might have been Slack, but I think it started off as a gaming company, and the gaming company failed, but then they introduced communication system,
It
and then
might have
it
been
took
Slack.
off.
Yeah, I think it might have been.
It might have been,
It was like
yeah.
a
And
Skunkworks
so,
project or something to help with communication internally or something as they were building a game. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
yeah,
Somebody will let us know
yeah,
in the comments if
yeah,
we have that
yeah. Let
right.
us know.
Yeah.
But no, that's exactly what you're talking about. And if you don't have a psychologically safe environment, you don't allow your employees to speak their mind or speak up. You don't allow for innovation. All those things become stifled, and you become stagnant as a company, right?
Mm-hmm.
You and I both have probably seen or been a part of companies that have allowed that to
Well,
happen.
it's funny you say that. Like, I think it reminds me of this story that one of my cousins in San Francisco told me, and his wife works, wife's sister works at Google, and I think Google has been like one of
Hmm.
those at scale companies that have been demonstrative of a culture of like innovation
Yeah.
and embracing failure.
Yep.
But I had heard through him that there could be like sometimes half a dozen to a dozen product teams working on the same piece of technology, but developing them 6, 12 different ways. And
Hmm.
they don't know. It's only one of those products that's going to go to market, and the other ones would be
Yeah.
deemed failures. But, you think
Yeah.
about that, right? Like at that scale, to have half a dozen to a dozen engineering teams working on building something that the vast majority of them will never be taken to market. One of them will. Maybe there's
Yeah.
some lessons learned in the other 5 to 11 companies that help the one that goes to market. But like that is a culture of embracing failure, failing fast, fail
Yeah.
forward, like all those things that we hear. I think that's always been pretty cool about the Google culture, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. I'll say one more and then I'll go to the next question. But the reason that the iPhone exists is because of a company called General Magic. They started doing documentaries on there. There's a documentary on Max. It used to be HBO Max now. Um, but General Magic was technically a failure as a company, but it allowed us to build the iPhone that the majority of us use, right? And so it's like there's but this goes back to what you were saying. I know this isn't like necessarily the topic, but there are so many people out there only promoting the successes of their company, of themselves, and that's not like, this success isn't linear. And so I think that if we're giving this false perception, then it ruins kind of the beauty of a startup, right? I did another post last week where it was like, I love startups because they're relentless.
Mm.
They're relentless and they're resourceful and they're resilient. But the only way that they become that is through failure and failure and failure and a bunch of no's until it turns into yeses. And so, like, like, this is a little tangent, but I think it's important to call out because, as a founder of Grapevine, pre-revenue, pre-launch, we are coming in with a lot of assumptions. Like, this is our ICP, or these people are our ICP, ideal customer profile. We think these are the problems that we're solving because we built it from like, some of it came from like a Kumu experience working 100% remotely, and then I tried to build it with our product and it didn't work, and so now I went and did my own thing. But yeah, all those things come together and it gives you a reality instead of a illusion of perfection.
Mm.
Like, Steve Jobs isn't perfect, Elon Musk isn't perfect. Well, we know he's not perfect now, but there's a lot of examples out there. So I don't know if you want to add
No, I'm
anything
just
to
going to
that,
say,
but
so long as you're a continuous learner and that's part of something like that as part of your value set, then like as you go through building Grapevine with all of these assumptions, you're going to go out and challenge those assumptions by spending a lot of time with prospects and customers and
mhm,
understanding and pressure testing all those assumptions. And as
yeah,
you do that, you're going to learn. And as you learn, you're going to be able to adapt those things into how you build the company and the product and your go to market strategy and all these things. And you're going to be better
yeah.
off as a result of that.
And just for like any founder that's listening, we aren't going into this blind either. So we did a lot of like product validation with the concept, and then we had UI UX design, and then we spoke to them, and we did tweak certain things based off of some of the things that we learned from them. But yeah, the real meat of that in becoming a better company is taking those prospects who turn into customers, and then, because they actually paid and now they're actually using it, and so being able to take that. I want to switch gears. It's kind of still on the same subject, but I wanted to pull it back in. So looking ahead, what do you envision for the future of flexible work, and how can organizations prepare for upcoming trends and challenges from your perspective, and maybe what you know about Grapevine that other people don't know yet?
Yeah. Well, listen, if I kind of take and pull from some of our conversation today, one is going to be like continuous enablement. One of them is going to
Yeah.
be like the thing that I learned at CDW. And to your point earlier, to answer your question, JD went through continuous leadership training too, right? So it's not
Yeah.
just for the
Yeah.
rank and file or the boots on the street, so to speak. It was for the leaders too. And so, like, how are we constantly sharpening everybody's blades? That's going to be an
Yeah.
important piece to this. The second, I think, goes to like the tech that we use. That's another big part
Yeah.
about this. And yes, I know it's self-serving to Grapevine, but you in an ecosystem of, I would categorize like there's an explosion of tech going
Yeah.
into supporting remote and hybrid work. But that ecosystem, the quality of it, the quality of how we implement those technologies, I think is going to be another wave to, how we can effectively grow companies hybrid and remote first. That's going to be another big
Yeah.
part about it, without a doubt. Look at through the pandemic, right? Like we all went
Hmm.
from, maybe using like a GoToMeeting or tools like that
Yeah.
to now having, these synchronous capabilities like here through Zoom. Um,
Hmm.
you know, I mean, you can pick the pillars, right? You and I have spent a lot of time on remote work tech. There's so many
Yeah.
things being developed that
Yeah.
in aggregate are going to be what helps companies transform, lead, and grow through this period of change.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think it's the having the foundation that in office people didn't necessarily have, because they could get away with it, because if you're in office you can go over to somebody in their cubicle, you can pull them into a conference. That doesn't mean that it's better. In my opinion, that actually means that it's masking what needs to happen, as we talked about at the beginning of this podcast. So but now it's for the fun time, because I'm going to go into the lightning round. So I always do this with every guest that we have on Untangled Vines. So are you ready for the lightning round?
Yeah, I don't know what I'm subscribing to, but it sounds fun.
Exactly. We keep this part hidden so you don't know what to come in with. Okay, so I already know the answer to some of these, but coffee or tea? Coffee or tea for early morning Zoom meetings?
100% coffee. 100% of the time.
Yep,
Yeah.
I knew that. uh, oh, so I kind of maybe know this one, but maybe not. Favorite remote work playlist or music genre?
I mean, hip hop, you know me, all day, every day. Hip
Yeah.
hop, right? Put on some music, bang through work. That's the thing.
If you had to choose, this is just a follow up. If you had to choose one artist to listen to for your entire life, well, who would it be? Or group?
Okay, like the last 2 weeks I've been on a Jay-Z thing.
Yeah.
Like it's been moving through the 90s all the way up to today, just like banging through Jay tracks. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, I'll stick with Jay.
That makes sense, because I feel like Jay speaks our language. Like, he's not just rapping about culture, but he's rapping about business now too.
Yeah, well, I think
So
that's an interesting
that makes
evolution. I
sense.
think it's a great call out. Yeah, he went from
Yeah.
hustler to you know all the other normal parts of hip hop progression, and then now into this stream of maturity and growth and building companies, success. You know,
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. Most creative location you've worked from remotely?
ooh. Well, I have a struggle with like not working out of this office, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Same.
But honestly, some of the most creative work I get done, I don't know if it's work, but like I advance thinking through walking. So like when I go out
Nice.
for walks, whether it's with the dog or by myself, like I find I get moments of clarity walking.
Yeah. That makes sense, because I need to do that more. Because like whenever you disconnect for a little bit and you can collect your thoughts, it is good for like the brain psychology, so you can rejuvenate what you've kind of been diminishing from the time you sign on until you take that walk. But yeah, just being able to have your thoughts in a peaceful moment in a busy world,
Yep.
that always helps. How do you, speaking of this, and it might be the same answer, how do you combat Zoom or MS Teams or Google Meets fatigue?
Okay, so the walks definitely help. Time blocking has been another big thing that I've been doing in my calendar. So like just giving me adequate time. I mean, you worked on my team when I wasn't doing this so well, like where I was like 10 hours back to back Zoom calls. And
Oh
months of
yeah.
that led to like migraines for the very first time in my life. And so like now
Mm,
I'm like, when I do a 30-minute meeting, it's 25 minutes in the schedule. So I have 5 minutes in between. I am blocking
yeah.
time to walk every day. I'm blocking time in my morning hours, even before my kids get up, to work out, do my sauna, do my cold shower, cold plunge. Like that is time I put in my calendar.
Nice.
The writing I'm doing on LinkedIn is being put into calendar. The time with certain clients and customers and startups that I'm helping, those are getting scheduled appropriately. So like all of that has been helpful in making sure that I have moments
Nice.
to breathe and come up for air.
Yeah. That's something that I need to work on too.
Work in
But
progress, young grasshopper. Work in progress. I mean, all this stuff I say, like a lot of it, I'm still working on myself.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so name one unexpected benefit of remote work for you.
Ooh. Unexpected, quite frankly, is picking up my kids. So I have this
Hmm.
thing that, like, come 3:30, if I'm in Toronto and I'm not traveling, I pick up my kids 100% of the time. And that to
Nice.
me is something that I'm not sure I could ever put a price tag on. Like, I'm not sure I'd ever give that up again.
Yeah. And just to call this out, like whenever Grapevine or I talk about like remote work or flexible work, that's what we're talking about. I read a quote the other day where it says like whenever we talk about flexible work, it's not less work, it's more life.
Yeah.
And that
Yep.
is crazy.
Yep.
Like I get to see Caitlin whenever now she's a nurse practitioner, so she has more of a full schedule. Where as a nurse, it was like 3 on, 2 off, whatever the case is. But like I get to spend time with my dog, I get to spend time with Caitlin, and so it just it's this thing that people didn't think about. I mean, or maybe they thought about it, but they didn't think that it could be a reality before the pandemic. Now you have people like yourself, like C-suite executives, working from home and still being able to see their children, where
Yeah.
before they might have had like 12-hour days and then 2-hour commutes. And now like what else, what is left? You get home, maybe you tuck them in, and then that's it really. And then you
And that's
go to
just
sleep
not
and
good.
wake
And
up and do
that's
it all
not good
again.
enough. Right? That's not good
No,
enough. Honestly,
exactly.
this is one of the biggest reasons why I will always be building in hybrid. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not opposed, by the way, for the record, and I know you might not like this, but like, I'm not opposed to people having an office. But what I am
Yeah.
opposed of is having everybody be there 5 days of the week. That I'm highly opposed to.
Yeah.
I think like you and I used to talk about this in our last life with asynchronous video. The power is
Yeah.
I get to record when it's convenient for me, and you get to
Hmm.
consume it when it's convenient for you. And if we pull on
Exactly.
that thread with work, we should be
Hmm.
able to deliver results, because that's what it's all about in my book. I don't care about the inputs, I
Yeah.
care about the outputs. We should be able to
Yeah.
deliver the outputs of a business wherever we are and whenever we want
Exactly.
to get that done. Again, respecting timelines, obviously. In business, you got to have timelines. But like once we set the
Yeah.
timeline for a given project or a task or whatever it is, like it shouldn't matter how you do it, where you do it, just get shit done.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And just to be frank, like I think it's great to have an office if it makes sense. I think that if you could, like, and I've said this on a couple other podcasts or blog posts or whatever, but it's not about not having an office. It's about having, or you don't have the need for an office. And so like, instead of the office, you do once a quarter offsites with your team where they get together, or you maybe have like a co-working space that you rent out, and then you put like an employee budget on it. So all that kind of stuff. There's different ways to go about it, but it's really that choice, that flexibility that is important. Yeah, like going to the office 5 days a week, I think is dead. I don't think that it needs to be
I think
there.
that's right.
But just to preface it, like you said at the beginning, it's not, I mean, it's mainly for knowledge workers. But we even see certain areas where it's like telehealth, where now a PA, a doctor, a nurse practitioner can work from home 100% if they want to. You know, it's about that choice. And so, and the only way that we do that is through technology, honestly, right? That is the structure that can make this stuff happen. And if we looked in the market and we didn't think that there was something out there that was specific for remote and hybrid solutions. And so, at least in an all-in-one platform, there's a lot of separate tools out there, and we've seen where that can actually cause fatigue, where you have to go to all these different locations just to find a document or just to do whatever you're trying to do. So I'll get off my tangent there, but
Yeah.
just to continue, because none of the, just FYI, none of these lightning rounds are actually lightning.
They
So
spur thought.
remote.
Yeah.
Exactly. Remote work, pet peeve, what drives you crazy? This is always the one that makes people think the longest.
Pet peeve of remote work? Maybe I do have a pet peeve with people thinking that like because we're remote, we can always just jump on a call.
Ooh,
That kind of that irks me. And it's no different than like being in an office, you know, like, dude, when we were building SceneDoc, one of the things my engineers used to teach me is that most of them, as they were writing software, would have headphones on, and it would drive them bonkers when Alex used to come around and tap them on their shoulder, because what I got to learn is when they're in deep thought, writing code and, you know, solving problems, that I really interrupt their flow by doing that. And so we had this rule that like if one headphone was up, then Alex could come bother us or ask us a question. And if it was both down, it was like, you know, they're in deep focus work. And dude, I think that's the same with like, you know, now that we're in this remote environment, just because somebody's now working from home or working from anywhere, it should not equate to, hey, I get to go and like grab them immediately.
Yeah. You know, no, that's a big call out, because I just watched a podcast. I can't remember what podcast or who it was on, but they were talking about the same exact thing. Whenever developers are heads down coding and then you interrupt them, that messes them up for a decent amount of time. There's a book actually called Flow, and I always get his name wrong, but it's like Mayim Chomsky or something like that. It's a very long word. But it takes about 26 to 29 minutes to get back into flow. So every time that somebody is interrupting, whether they're a coder or somebody in deep flow work, now not only are they interrupting them for that 5 minutes, they're actually interrupting them for 35 minutes because it takes them that long to get back into it. So these are like certain things that people don't necessarily know if they don't like study psychology or that kind of stuff, but it's very important. And that's spot on for remote work, where you are accessible through all these different technologies. But I think that you also have to factor in, how can you allow your people to have deep flow work? Because that's actually where the work gets done. It's not in these Zoom meetings for the most part. Like sometimes you have working sessions, but that's where the actual work gets done.
Couldn't agree more.
So that's a good call out. Describe your dream virtual team building activity. You can pull from one that you've already done or something that.
Well, you don't have deep love for wine, so my dream decompression, something we're going to do into the community in 2024, as you know, is building in times where teams can learn about wine, drink wine, and, you know, pull yourself out of the business, quite frankly. Did that answer your question?
That's why you're.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's why you're a founding advisor of Grapevine.
Oh, that's a good one. I didn't even get that. That's true. I love me some grape. Yeah.
So the last one, share a quick tip for staying motivated while working remotely.
I don't know if it's about working remotely, but like, so what the one that I always think about is my kids. I know, like, it sounds
Mm.
mushy and maybe even cliche, but honestly,
No,
like
no.
in tough moments or times where I want to like hang it up and like take a break, or not work on something challenging, I think about like, okay, what would Cameron and Kendall say, or is this what I'd want them to see? And so
Yeah.
like I tend to like use them as my the added push that I might need to get something over a finish line, or to work on something challenging or hard. um,
Yeah.
definitely motivates me.
And I've seen that firsthand from working with you, because you mentioned the community uh, that you'll be launching soon, and we were working on the website together, and we started off in one direction, and then it would switch not only from your kids' input but from your wife as
Yeah.
well. And so you're not only like, just for people listening, like, Alex isn't only just saying these things, he actually does it. And whether or not you know it, it kind of transcends into how I operate too. So it's yeah, we were talking about this with, like you said, drink champs, they give you your flowers while you're still here. So those are the flowers for you.
I appreciate it, man. I appreciate it. Yeah.
But that was a great conversation. Like I said, I got to look back and kind of digest everything that we talked about, because I think that is going to be valuable. But Alex, thanks so much for being our founding advisor, also a part of the Untangled Vines community, and being a guest on this podcast. And I think we'll probably have you on again sometime.
No problem. Anytime, man. It was fun, and thanks for the platform, and super proud of you too, man. Keep building.